and welcome to Unpublished Opinions, an Institute for Justice Roundtable podcast, the podcast where IJ attorneys get together and give their unvarnished and unpublished opinions about the law. I'm your host, John Wrench, the Assistant Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice, and we're recording this on September 29th, 2025, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues Diana Simpson and Patrick Giacomo. Diana and Patrick, welcome on.
Hey, John.
Good day.
So Constitution Day was this month in September. It was on September 17th, and it commemorates the signing of the U.S. Constitution by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And although Constitution Day was on the 17th, maybe not everybody knew this, but there's actually a Constitution Week that runs until a week from that day, until the next Wednesday. And so during that time, there's a whole week of Constitution-related celebrations. Of course, no one violates the Constitution during that time. Everybody thinks very deeply about it.
I would suggest every day is Constitution Day.
That's absolutely.
Because it's important.
I think John was just describing like the sort of inverse version of the purge that we all live inside of.
Yeah, if you're someone who doesn't think that we should be celebrating the Constitution more often, the Constitution does actually protect your right to think that, even to like write a book about it, to make a podcast about it. But yes, I think that if you are that kind of person, this probably isn't going to be your episode because we're pretty keen on the Constitution.
I suspect that type of person is not too keen on IJ to begin with.
Right. I mean, if they would have to be pretty open-minded in a very strange way to be here listening to that podcast. But if you are,
so if you think the Constitution is not a suicide pact, you can just log off right now.
Absolutely. Or just keep us in the background. But so we at IJ though are very keen on the Constitution, and you're fortunate enough to hear from some colleagues who think about the Constitution quite a lot and work with it in ways that, in my experience, give people kind of a unique perspective on the Constitution. So to kick us off, Diana is wondering, what's one thing that you wish everybody knew or understood about the Constitution?
That it's perfect as it was written, and it should be interpreted and appreciated, with the amendments too, and should be interpreted and appreciated and embraced and not ignored or relegated to an ink blot or disregarded or used as toilet paper. It's perfection. And as I said, with the amendments, the original version had some issues, particularly the Reconstruction amendments. We'll say that version is the perfect one. And it's just, it serves so well. And the fact that people ignore parts of it, I think, are where a lot of our problems come from, to kind of actually be very serious about it. Like the Constitution has flaws, but it was designed in a way to bring a group of people together in a way that protects as many rights as possible while allowing people to be represented in a form of government that enables the most kind of choice and representation possible. And the problems really arise when branches of government say, we don't care about that part, or, oh, surely they didn't mean that. And then they just kind of come up with something else on the fly that is contrary to what people agreed to be bound by.
So it sounds like part of that is selectively loving the Constitution is bad. And also the Constitution means what it says, or two big parts of that.
Yes. I think that's fair. I mean, there's so much to unwrap about the Constitution, right? Like there's the separation of powers. There's exactly how powers were delegated. It's that it's supposed to be the federal government is a limited government of enumerated powers. And a lot of our problems today exist because that was ignored.
I wish the listeners could see how Diana's eyes lit up when she said those things.
I'm an optimist at heart. It's hard to be pessimistic when you're talking about and thinking about the Constitution and where it came from and the changes it's made along the way, recognizing that it wasn't perfect. I say that it's perfect. It's the amendment process has made it better, and it just, when you think about what existed in the 18th century and what we were able to create, it's incredible to think about. I get like goo-goo-eyed about it all the time. And I am in this exact moment goo-goo-eyed about it. Recognizing it has flaws and men and women, people generally contribute to those flaws.
If all men were angels, right?
Exactly.
Patrick, do you have anything that you wish people knew about the Constitution?
I mean, it's tough to say that I only have one thing people should know about the Constitution, because I've engaged with a lot of people in the last year or so who seem to like to wrap themselves in the Constitution without any actual knowledge of the Constitution. And
you weren't talking about interacting with people on a particular website.
Well, I'm just any time you engage with folks on social media of any sort, you run into the most unbelievable confidence to knowledge ratio that you could imagine. People just like certain that you're a moron when they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And I think the core of my recommendation for civics learning in the United States would be for people to understand that the Constitution is a limitation on the government itself. And from that principle, you see a lot of things flow that people don't seem to understand. And chief among those over the last 10 months or so has been the difficulty people have had grappling with the idea that, for instance, the rights in our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, aren't just limited to citizens of the United States, for instance, because, and you can read the amendments yourself, this is very clear in the way they're written, those amendments are limitations on the government's use of its powers. So like Diana said, the federal government is way outside of the lines of what was designed for it in terms of the enumerated powers, because, to Diana's point, a lot of people don't seem to understand that our federal government is supposed to only be able to do the small number of things that the Constitution says it can do. But even setting that aside, now it's gotten outside of those bounds. And so when it's exercising its correct authority, that authority should be curbed in such a way that it doesn't violate, for instance, the freedom of speech, or does not allow for unreasonable searches and seizures, or for cruel and unusual punishment, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we've seen a lot of really silly takes from people in the legal space that seem to understand the Constitution as, instead of being a limitation on government, actually the thing that gives us our rights. And anyone who knows anything about rights, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, should understand their source to not be the government itself, because if they are, then the government can take them in just as flippant a way as it can give them.
Yeah, so I like the last thing that you said, because that would be my I wish people understood, in part because not only do I think it's important the concept that rights pre-exist government, but it's not only that it's important, it's kind of this background assumption that's baked into the U.S. Constitution, the state constitutions, Declaration of Independence, all the state declarations, basically everything that was going on during that period of time. But it's certainly not public knowledge in the sense that it's part of civics education. I think that, I've been shocked to see some reactions in the news. I remember there's a TV host who, in the last, I think, year or so, was responding to someone saying pre-political rights as if that was a ridiculous thing to say, as if it was like silly and laughable. And that's just a kind of a failure on the part of civics education. But I think if you can't grasp the idea that rights pre-exist governments, that the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were not about that. They weren't about whether rights pre-existed government. It was about, whether you should enumerate some of those rights or not. And it just changes what the Constitution, our understanding of what the Constitution is, right? It's not a list of the rights that the government has given you. It's an acknowledgement that those rights exist, and that if, really when the government's going to encroach on them, there's some kind of record of those rights that you can rely on. And it seems like that the background principles of the Constitution have, they've kind of disappeared from public knowledge bit.
There was a recent debate between two senators on that exact topic within the last, month? Mm-hmm. And without taking political sides on either issue and which one is better or which one is worse, I was stunned by the concept that a sitting United States senator suggested that the Constitution is the source of our rights. The government is the source of our rights. Because when you think about the implications of that, there's not really a functioning government in Haiti. Do those people not have rights because they don't have a government to provide them the rights? Like, that's just a stunning concept to me. And that, like, wherever we come from, whatever our source on this planet is, surely our rights and our ability to exist and defend ourselves and defend our families, like, that predates whatever form of government we have decided to group ourselves into. And like that's not a religious statement. That's not even a political statement. That's just a matter of how we exist as bipedal beings.
Well, I think, I don't know if walking on 2 feet necessarily features into the analysis, but yeah, I think the part of the problem is that these are kind of inherently more abstract concepts. And so when people learn about civics, it's often something that's not taught or mentioned in passing as like a premise that then goes on forward. And people are struggling to, remember, well, what was the First Amendment? What was the Second or the Third? What's the Third Amendment? What about Article 2? What's Article 1? All those things are where people get bound up, but they just lose sight of the first principles. And frankly, if you have the first principles in mind, you can kind of have a pretty good handle on the way things might work, even if you don't know that much else about the written substance of the Constitution and its amendments. But yeah, it's endlessly frustrating because, like Diana said, we saw this debate recently, and the irony is, like, and I think we're going to talk about this in a little while, depending on what the subject matter is of any given debate, you'll see the people saying our rights come from the Constitution or they don't flip. And you'll say, like, oh, well, if our rights are inherent or granted by God or natural or whatever it is, the people that are arguing that, for instance, illegal aliens don't have any rights under the U.S. Constitution have no leg to stand on, because those people, as bipedal mammals, have the same inalienable rights that all of us have when we were, born onto this earth. And so, and you could just pick the opposite example too. It's all of it turns out to be, unfortunately, the discussion turns out to be very informed by partisan politics, and people tend to interpret the Constitution rather than from reading it and deciding what it meant at the time or should mean, but instead just wish casting what they would like it to mean or whatever. And obviously we see this right now with the debate over birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. And we saw this immediately after the 14th Amendment, like Diana referenced earlier, with the privileges or immunities clause getting nixed in the slaughterhouse cases. So it's nothing new, but it's still unfortunate and disappointing.
Yeah. Diana, do you have any favorite features of the Constitution? I know you list a lot of things that that you love about it, but it can be anything. It could be an amendment or the structure of it. And I know this is difficult because it is kind of
it's
one
like
of those
picking my
things.
favorite child.
Right.
They're both. I mean, I do have a preference. No, I don't. They're both perfect. You have one
Recorded
kid
for posterity.
Yeah, my favorite is Cora.
Oh, well, there you go. That's easy enough. I got 2. So one is my favorite blonde-haired child. One is my favorite brown-haired child. How about that? No, I mean, the 14th Amendment is like an easy answer because it does so much. It was intended to do so much. It covers a lot of ground. Privileges or immunities was supposed to be obviously much a thing as opposed to not a thing. And so that's an easy answer and probably my answer. But like also the amendment process, the fact that the Constitution itself can be amended and is subject to reasonable debate and changing tides. But like, it's a hard process. It's designed to be a hard process. It's not designed to be amended by tweet. It's designed to be a really intense thing that most people agree on. And I think that is a feature rather than a bug. And I know some people say, oh, well, it's too hard, so we should just give up. But no, like it's supposed to be hard. And so that might be a favorite. The 9th Amendment might be a favorite. It's, again, if it weren't ignored, that'd be pretty cool.
Imagine that.
Maybe I should just stop because I've got some more favorites too.
You're just gonna read them all off.
Well, not even just all the amendments, but like there's some good structural components too. But maybe I'll just stop talking for a minute so somebody else can say their favorite.
How Congress has the power to tariff, for instance. But it's I before I get into my favorite, I want to say I've been taking the mickey out of the current administration because they're the current administration, but hearing Diana say that just reminded me of how insane it was that like 2 weeks before the end of his term, Joe Biden just tweeted that congratulations, the Civil Rights Amendment actually is an amendment of the Constitution, and thought like it was the weirdest, like silliest thing. I just don't even know how to react to it.
See, that was fine. My problem with that wasn't so much that he tweeted that, because anybody can say Twitter. It was that
No.
that people took it seriously and said, he's right. It's now the 28th Amendment. It is not. Anyway,
Well,
I'm
no,
sorry.
I agree it isn't. But I'm saying if you're the president, I think you have an obligation to not pretend like you can amend the Constitution by just tweeting about it.
Sure.
And that was true for Joe Biden, and it's certainly true for Donald Trump. The tradition goes on continuing, which is the people in charge of the power of the government have very little regard for the limitations on that power, whether those come in the form of the original Constitution's provision of powers or the amendments limitations on those powers. I think my favorite part of the Constitution is, and I have fights with people about this a lot on the internet as the theme is growing. Starting around Juneteenth every year is when the fights begin, and they continue throughout most of the summer. But the 13th Amendment. I think the 13th Amendment and the end of chattel slavery in the United States was one of the greatest leaps forward in human liberty in the history of mankind. And I don't think we should lose sight of how horrible it was that, a large chunk of this country was, held in bondage for hundreds of years, and how important it was to us as a nation and to every human being on earth, frankly, for those chains to be broken. And it's shocking when you realize, how many human lifetimes away from that we are. It's not very many.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's something I've been thinking about recently of what are the founding American narratives, and one of them is certainly this exodus into a place out of what absolutely people at the time began to increasingly view as a kind of tyrannical authority, and into a promised land. There's definitely that mythology there of this promised land that has this limitless opportunity and liberty. And so for that to then come into conflict with the actual practices of the time later in that very country, and then for that to have to be vindicated with, I think there are valuable lessons in the imperfections of the Constitution itself and the people who wrote it with respect to their relationship to the Constitution. And I think many of those people were aware of the tensions between the positions they espoused and the positions they lived by. And I think it's a useful reminder to people that, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good, and that even really smart and otherwise great people do evil and terrible things. And so life is a lot more complicated than simply saying, here's a good guy and here's a bad guy. And, I've, along the same lines of my Juneteenth comment, I've been having a number of discussions with people online about the merits of John Brown, the famous American abolitionist. And so he did a lot of stuff that I probably would have decried if I had been alive at the time. But fundamentally, I think he was a force for good, and other people can disagree. That's fine. But the point is, all of us as human beings are imperfect, and that's why our rights come to us, inherently before any sort of government exists. And then we kind of figure out the best way to manage that. And I think the American Constitution is the world's greatest tool of actually accomplishing that goal. Yeah, this idea of, as I'm sure many people have heard this criticism often of not only the U.S. Constitution, but the Declaration and kind of the founding ethos is that those people were hypocrites, right? Because they simultaneously espouse these views about universal dignity and freedom, and then in their personal lives, some of them did not reach those ideals. But I would any day take a group of people espousing better principles who are in a position where they are going to struggle to meet them, if not outright fail to meet them, but agree that they are the principles that we should be reaching towards, because eventually that's what creates that tension where you have to give in and actually align to the principle or not. And, I think that's one of the beauties of that is the amendment process, not every amendment, but the amendment process and a lot of the ways in which the Constitution has developed, I think, are reflections of us taking those steps. So speaking of amendments, are there any amendments or changes that you would make to the Constitution? We can start with Diana.
So, as a practical matter, I think a remedies clause is something that would be that would have the biggest impact most broadly, right? An amendment that, say the 28th Amendment, everything we said in here is a plaintiff can take into federal court and sue the government for having violated. And, you don't have to have a separate federal statute giving you the ability to get into court. You can seek damages, you can seek whatever, because if you're going to list out all of these things that the government cannot do, but then have the courts say, gotcha, you can't actually get into court, what's the point? Why would they have written this? Why would they have written all of these amendments, sometimes in blood, and say, well, but there's no remedy for it? And to me, that's outlandish, right? So without Section 1983, without Bivens, without the FTCA, what are you left with? You're left with gaping holes where there are violations of your rights, and you are just out of luck. And that cannot be the system that we're in, and that's how the system has been interpreted. That's how the Constitution has been interpreted, I think incorrectly. But I think that would have a large impact immediately. I think it's unnecessary. I think that it shouldn't have to exist. I don't think that's how the Constitution was written and should be interpreted, but that's the world that we exist in right now. And I think if that amendment were added tomorrow, we would see a lot of value.
Yeah. Patrick, I imagine you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think obviously it's very silly for us this is something that, again, it changes hands on a partisan basis depending on who wields the sword. But Antonin Scalia very famously said, if you want to read a constitution that's very protective of individual rights, you can read the Soviet Constitution. But it's not enforceable. Nobody thinks this is a real thing. And so what you have, unless you have an enforceable protection of individual rights, is what he called a parchment promise. And yeah, I mean, the idea that you have rights that are unenforceable, it questions definitionally what a right even is. And so, yes, I certainly agree with Diana that the thing I would change, and it doesn't need to be done. It's the same question I answer all the time when people ask, well, how would you have written Section 1983 to make sure there was no qualified immunity, for instance? I was like, well, the way it was written would have been fine.
Right.
And
we'd
so
go back in time and unmake up qualified immunity.
Exactly. So you really do have to, it gives me, let me put it this way, it gives me some sympathy for the sort of sloppy legal drafting that you see all the time in like settlement agreements or whatever, with all of like the extraneous language of heretofore heirs assigned, devisees, et cetera, including but not limited to. It's like, well, I guess you really did have to write all that stuff down, because if there's any room for wiggling, the courts will find a way to wiggle in favor of the government, because the courts, of course, are part of the government too. And so that's very problematic. Now, to make the conversation more interesting, because Diana just said all that same stuff.
I'm sorry, the Anti-Federalists were right.
I was just going to say, it sounds like one takeaway from that is that the Anti-Federalists were not just being conspiratorial and hyper worried, but were actually had a finger on the pulse of
no question
how this worked.
No question about it. And we know that because not only are we having the remedy difficulties we see today, but because the Ninth Amendment exists and has absolutely no effect, and has been called, like Diana mentioned earlier, an ink blot. And we know that can't be true. I mean, this is as basic as it gets in terms of legal interpretation skills. Is like, it doesn't mean nothing. Whatever it means, it has to mean something. But
I was going to say, maybe we have an amendment that says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. I mean, that would be a great amendment.
Exactly. I would say if I were to amend the Constitution for the sake of the podcast, I've rolled out this theory other times, but I would propose an amendment that basically makes it a capital crime for any member of Congress to leave their district while they're in office. And so all votes would have to be done over the phone or over Zoom or whatever, but like you have to live in the bed that you've made in your state or your district, and you don't just get to come like schmooze together in Washington, D.C. So that would be a fun amendment that I would offer. I'd
be curious to see the political process dealing with that proposal. You might get some pushback.
Well, I've faced it down before, so I'll do it again.
Yeah, you'd be busy on social media. I think mine would be the Ninth Amendment. It's just it's wise to have it in the Constitution. It was wise to think it'd be great. It's great to have amendments or rights enumerated, but even then, I want to be double, triple clear that there are rights that pre-exist the government, and to have that in an amendment and then to have it ignored is pretty shocking. Though it's hard to say, you know, what would you amend the Constitution to say that's not just flippantly saying the Ninth Amendment means what it says, though there's plenty of things in the Constitution where that's almost what needs to be there, is like this meant what it said. But that would be nice. I do think that's something, and I don't know if this is a constitutional amendment issue or something else, but I would like to see something that's about like digital privacy or surveillance. I don't know if that's something that would succeed as an amendment process, but I'm kind of concerned about how those things affect not only just like Fourth Amendment stuff is the most obvious example, but also free speech stuff, and basically every other right. Kind of concerned about how that stuff is handled, and I don't think it would be a bad thing to get some kind of like national consensus on digital privacy and stuff. Any thoughts on that one?
I mean,
you can gun it down if you want.
I guess I just, if the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment are properly interpreted, wouldn't they cover our lives digitally as they cover our lives otherwise? Analog. There we go. Like, wouldn't it theoretically exist in the same way? And it's supposed to. I mean, you know, we write briefs all the time saying the Fourth Amendment operates, you know, online as it does in real life, as does the First. The First Amendment applies to books, the printing press, as well as the internet.
I strongly oppose John's proposal on the basis that I serve Rocco's Basilisk. And I want to be on record about this.
Yeah, this is a good place to be on record about that. We won't go into it on this podcast, but
it might be immoral even to
people
bring it
go
up.
look it up and horrify themselves.
Don't look it up.
Don't look it up.
Don't do it, Diana. I swear, don't do it. You're going to regret it. I think don't do it. No one look it up.
All right.
I think my concern with why I would propose that is, I guess I would be concerned if Fourth Amendment stuff became, and I don't think this on its own is necessarily a bad thing, but if we had a more sophisticated understanding of what you own or have rights to, I would be concerned if excised from that was certain things that are now maybe kind of like third party, like not covered under third party doctrine or stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like, it would almost be to correct in some ways third party stuff. However, yes, I would like that corrected as a matter of Fourth Amendment doctrine.
Right. I think we can correct it as the doctrine exists today, because I agree with Diana. I mean, these are principles that can be applied across time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this is a bit connected to what Patrick was mentioning before, is this idea that when constitutional rights are changing hands or being emphasized in different ways for partisan reasons, it has an effect on how we think about constitutional rights in the Constitution. I've been thinking about how IJ's work in particular cuts across people's political priors on this and their expectations. So, for example, people might react to our work challenging qualified immunity or our Fourth Amendment work or charitable sharing cases, viewing that work as kind of like left-coded while thinking of our licensing and our property rights and our school choice work as more right-coded. And I think that sometimes is confusing to people. And although it might be inevitable that some rights are made into a kind of partisan issue when they're picked up by a political party and championed by them, it also seems to me that there's a real danger in thinking of constitutional rights as politically coded at all. So starting with Patrick, I was wondering what you think about that. Should people reject thinking of constitutional rights through a partisan lens, or is it inevitable, and just kind of how those things, you know, a right is ignored and so it gets picked up as a political issue and so we can't really avoid it being done? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the partisan valence of rights is a terrible thing. And, you know, I'm very proud that IJ takes the positions it does on these different issues that are coded left or coded right, because it means that we have a set of principles that apply across the gamut of how, you know, those principles actually work in the real world. And so, you know, there might be situations where you see our economic liberty work doing something that is otherwise left coded. And there are definitely ways in which you could see our immunities work doing something that's right coded. For instance, you know, if a college administrator kicked a Christian group off campus or something like that, and fighting against qualified immunity for that person or whatever it is. I think it's incredibly important. And the thing that's frustrating and the real flaw in all this is that you see this every time the administration changes from one to the other. All the people that used to be cheering you on as you fought the government are now denouncing you or whatever. And, I can see it now, even now as I, continuously criticize the current government, and then I'll post something about how I like capitalism, and then all the people will be like, oh, are you serious? So although that's becoming less of a partisan issue, unfortunately, too, as the government takes ownership interests in major corporations and things like that. But I think it's incredibly important. And I've talked about this, IJ talks about this, which is, why would you want to create a weapon that your enemy is going to get and be able to use against you? Why should we not all agree that the solution here is to take the weapons away from the government itself, and then they can't be used as a way to retaliate against your enemies or a way to, extract wealth from a class of people who you don't like and give it to one who you do like, and all these other sorts of things. I think the whole concept of rights is that they are universal and that therefore they can't be necessarily coded one way or the other. And, the list of rights should be much bigger than it is, but the list that we're working with in large part because of the first 8 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, at least, is a relatively small list of rights. So it's not asking a lot to say, like, yeah, I should be allowed to speak freely. I should be entitled to due process. I should be able to feel secure in my house. I should not be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. I should have a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this stuff is not asking a lot from the government. And the fact that, no matter who's in charge, when it's being wielded in a way people like or dislike, they're willing to discard those needs is very disappointing and very counterproductive for the value of human existence.
Diana, what do you think about the partisanization of rights?
Yeah, so I find myself when I'm talking to people who are unfamiliar with our work or unfamiliar with us generally, whether I'm kind of traveling for work or just chatting with a new neighbor or something like that, I always say that I sue the government when they violate people's rights, and business is booming. And it does not matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter where I am in the country. Business is always booming. And I usually get a chuckle out of that from people that when they're like, oh yeah, business is booming, ha ha ha. And I'm like, no, but real, like it doesn't matter, and I'm that's not like a coded way of saying I don't like the president now. That's just the relationship that I have with our government, is that the government is always trying to take the government. It's not even the federal government, the local government, the state government. They're always trying to take from us as people and to extract from us our rights. And that's something that is wrong. And so to me, it doesn't matter who's in charge. It's just some days it's the red guy, some days it's the blue guy. And that's frustrating. And it's also very freeing in some ways because, it just lets us focus on our work, right? Because when so I'm representing, the day before Constitution Day, I argued at the Ninth Circuit on behalf of a grandmother who was arrested for feeding homeless people. And that, some people think that that's a left-leaning case. Some people think it's right-leaning. But it doesn't matter, right? She was doing something that was kind for other people that people have done for others since time began, right? Like people have engaged in charitable activities since the beginning of time. And that predates the political parties. And so it's very freeing to just be able to go up at argument. And it doesn't matter who appointed which judges that I'm arguing in front of. It's just, this is the way that it is. This is what she's doing. This is how the Constitution protects it. And it's just so freeing because, in some ways, I think people who are doing a lot more partisan focused work, who is appointed on that panel is the be all end all of their litigation. And for us, it doesn't always cut that way. Sometimes I think it cuts more in that direction, depending on our case. This particular one, I think, transcends the left-right divide in some ways. But I think some of our cases, it's more of an issue. But I don't know. It's like on Twitter, or not Twitter, it's like on Reddit, right? There's this page, right, where it asks, if am I being unreasonable is the kind of polite language way of saying it. And there's an answer to it where everybody sucks here. And it's like, okay, well, you're a little wrong. The person you're offended by is a little wrong. Everybody sucks here. And like, that's kind of how I feel about our political system. And so being a thorn in the side of that is really awesome.
See, I think I actually take a related but separate realization out of the work that we do, which is, so much of what we're doing with selecting our cases and figuring out what to litigate is focused on, finding things that will outrage normal people because of what happened there just seems so unjust. And I think the lesson that's built into that is that most normal people who aren't just like vapid partisans, they will look at a situation like yours and not apply some partisan valence and say, well, that's crazy. And they'll look at a situation like one of my left-coded cases and say the same thing. And, those are some of the reasons why IJ picks our cases, is because there are certain things that people just think, well, whatever the case may be, this is wrong. And I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is, again, if you just can get to the first principles of it, which is everyone has this innate sense of certain things are just, you've gone too far, you've done something too egregious, or you're being too mean, or you're trying to stop someone who's doing something good, or whatever it is. Everyone agrees that's wrong, and then everything else is kind of backfilled in. And so a lot of what we're doing as attorneys is just being able to translate that feeling that most of our aunts have when we tell them about our cases into the legal parlance that we need to win them.
Yeah, I definitely think that is a big part of the like depoliticizing rights, and like why we're so, IJ is very effective at it through the cases, because the cases are like, you can have any political opinion in the world. What the case requires you to do is look at a very concrete situation and then just respond to it with the kind of basic moral political intuitions that you have, and come out on the side of, do you think that this is just? Like, do you think that this is a good thing? Do you want to live in a country where this is a normal thing? Or do you not like it? And I think that's the incredible thing about the cases is it's not in a political box as much as it just falls within that core of things that are morally and politically outrageous. Not political in the sense of partisan, but political in the sense that, I think if the framers of the Constitution would have witnessed those things, they would have thought that it was like politically despicable. And so it's those things as almost hypotheticals, I think break people's partisan view of rights in a way that's very useful, because we're so caught up in viewing rights as partisan right now. I mean, you can turn on basically the news, and depending on which decade you're watching, like both of you have said during this conversation, those rights will be championed by one side or another, and then it will flip. And so there's not this kind of faithful love of those rights, and that's something that would it would be great to bring back. To something that Patrick said earlier about, we're just kind of opposed to creating this tool that the next person is going to use to do with it. Even if you like who is in charge of the tool right now or who will be wielding it, eventually will end up in the hands of someone who you're kind of concerned with how they want to use it. I think part of why it's hard to get people to back away from that approach right now is kind of a dark reason, which is that I think that there is a sense as things have gotten more people have gotten more radicalized and polarized politically, is that I think there's a sense politically that it would, if you just make the tool powerful enough, you can have this like total and complete victory once and for all. And so you just need to beef the tool up as much as possible. And like now, like strike while the iron is hot. Like if you do it now, you can actually win completely, which is actually the scariest possible response to maybe we should back away from the tool. It's like, no, if I just juice it up even more right now, we can actually just win this political battle.
I'm not sure that's it as much as it's people. So one side, like it's happened to them and now they have the ability to fight back. And so now they're saying, okay, well, everything we said before, this is different. So we're just doing the same. Everyone's doing the same thing. But like, if you want to take a specific example, right? Like one party got rid of the filibuster for judicial nominees, for lower court judicial nominees, right? And so the obvious next step is for the other party to get rid of higher court judicial nominee filibusters. And they did. And like, it's like this race to the bottom. Like it's, okay, well, I've got this power now, and I'm going to exercise it in a way that I know will help my party. And so is the other side going to do it when they're in control? Probably. But then we'll do something else worse too. And so, or it's not even that, or it's just a pessimism that like, I know that if I don't do it now, they're going to do it next. And so I just need to do it to advance my goal right now. And future me will figure out the problem in the future. And future me will figure out how to respond to that problem in the future. And so it's pessimistic. I mean, and I think that that's a big part of kind of our political existence anyway. Is just
we've reached our Nash equilibrium here in this prisoner's dilemma. Unfortunately, we're both going to snitch on the other person because the other person's going to snitch on us, and that's, from anyone who's a genius who's into game theory like me, that's not the best place to be on the set of options, and so it's disappointing. I do think the good news is, or at least the optimism that I have is, all of us exist across all these different places. And so like, we do this for a living. We also have, relationships with normal people. And then we go into social media where the most insane people are. And it's really easy to assume watching TV or being on the internet that like most people have this level of fervor about all these topics. But in reality, most people, if you walk into a hardware store and strike up a conversation, will have no idea what you're talking about. If you try to talk like this, and I know that because, I have family members who spend most of their time watching, Fox News or MSNBC all day, all night, all day. And, when they try to engage you on these topics, even people who have, a fairly strong grasp on the who's who of political so-and-sos and all this stuff, they'll be talking about some sub-issue of a sub-issue. And you're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, it's almost a different language at a certain point. And so, I urge people to realize that
touch grass.
Touch grass. Fundamentally, we're all good people. Fundamentally, we do see things as outrages, and across, the political divide, most people see certain outrageous things as outrageous. And of course, there is always the margin, and that's the difficult place to work. But most people are still, in the right place, and seeing the worst political actors who almost always have the loudest voices and treating that like it's representative of society, I think is what makes a lot of people end up kind of giving in to hopelessness and feeling nihilistic about this whole experiment we have going on here.
Yeah, if you're told that other people, your fellow citizens, don't share a baseline conception of what human flourishing looks like, I think it's very easy to become hopeless about what exactly you're going to do. And then it's easy to kind of make things political in a way where maybe you can't cooperate with those people using your game theory thing.
I mean, this is like the opposite of a profound comment, but like when I get off of social media, I'm so much happier, right? Like I spend time with my kids, my dog, my husband. We go for a family walk every night and we leave our phones at home. And like we talk to our neighbors who, have a particular view of the world and I have no idea what it is. And like, honestly, I'm so much happier than when I used to check X or Twitter or whatever the heck, like all the time. And so it's, I tweeted the other day. It was like the first time in 3 weeks I think I'd tweeted. So Patrick, may I recommend that?
Yeah, I need to do a little detox.
You do. I say this as a friend.
The computer knows because it's actually been giving me advertisements for like various apps and devices that will like limit my ability to go on and use my phone to do certain things at certain times. So maybe it's time I need to just listen to that snake in the series of tubes that are the internet and buy one more product that will allow me to shut off my phone's ability to continue mainlining this stuff into my cerebral cortex.
See, we just have a box up where, like, when you first enter the house where we put our keys, it's like right next to that, we have a box where we can put our phones. And I don't always follow that, but like that's my favorite place to do it is just to pop it in there. And there's really not that many people who need me. And if they do, I'll hear the phone ring.
If there was just a box, I wouldn't have to buy anything else. So I don't know what I would do with that.
Contribute to capitalism today.
There it is.
You could just start selling. You can make a new product that is just the phone box. But
it's a Ziploc bag.
Yeah, but if you describe it that way, it's a box made specifically for this.
Phone sack.
Yeah.
.com.
sack, sanity, reclaim your sanity with the phone sack.
All right, that's trademarked, everybody.
You heard it here first.
Just get a shoebox, man.
So
Now we got to buy shoes now.
So before we wrap up, our listeners are always interested in what people at IJ are reading or watching or consuming to enrich you. So anything that you've been looking at that's one thing that's law related, and then one thing that's maybe not law related. If Diana, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm like big into the history and tradition type arguments. I've been making them a lot. I have a fair amount of these kind of homeless charity related type cases that I've been doing. And we just filed on Friday in New Mexico, related to a case we have pending there, kind of a deep dive into the history and tradition in New Mexico of people using their property to help others. And New Mexico has a particularly strong experience with this that much strong, like the US already has a really strong one, but even stronger than that, because both in the pre-colonization days and through colonization, through the Mexican-American War, and then through the United States, both becoming a territory and then eventually a state. And it's been just really cool to read about. Like, you know, I remember growing up, like reading about, I grew up in Colorado, so there was a fair amount of Native history that we learned, but a lot more of that. And it's been just really cool learning about how people helped each other from war and conquerors and danger from others, and also just danger from the environments. And the like kind of through line with all of this is that people open up their property to help others. And so we're using that to make an argument in our case that our client should be able to open up his property to help others. But anyway, so that's like my law thing. I don't have like a particular citation, because I think we did like 35 citations in our history and tradition section, which was really fun to write, and I enjoyed it very much. But I do have a citation for my non-legal one, and that's a book called Extreme Punishment by Stephen Epstein. I'm making my way through it. It's about Dan Markell, who was a Florida State law professor, I guess, who was tragically murdered in 2014. And it took like a couple of years for them to even arrest somebody related to the murder. But since then, 5 people have been convicted of his murder. And so the kind of what's shaken out about all of that is that Dan Markell's ex-wife's family hired hitmen to take him out because he was opposed to the children moving away from him. And it's a horribly tragic story. He was doing what any good dad would do and want to be around his kids, and he was murdered for it. And so since then, the 2 hitmen have been convicted, and the woman who was the connection between the hitmen and the ex-wife's family, and then Dan Markell's former brother-in-law and former mother-in-law have now been convicted, and the former mother-in-law was convicted just a couple of weeks ago. And so There are questions abound whether the ex-wife is about to see an arrest and face a trial or not. It's a horribly tragic story, but this book is like a really interesting deep dive into everything that happened and the trials, and it's just really interesting. So
this might be a stupid question, but Florida has the death penalty?
It does.
Yeah, and I imagine, I don't know if this is true for Florida, but I know in a lot of states the killing for hire is like
capital punishment.
Almost always capital, yeah.
Yeah, so no one has been sentenced to death. I think everyone so far is either a life sentence, or there was one guy who flipped and got like 19 years in prison, I think, and he was already serving like a 12-year sentence, so it was really just adding on a couple of years. But he was the connection between the hitmen and the family, and he was the one who testified about that. And so, yeah, it was a $100,000 hit, and they took a dad away from his kids and away from his life for a really terrible reason.
Wow.
Yeah.
Patrick, anything darker?
Yeah. Well, don't kill people. That's a lesson to live by. You can tell people.
Take that to the bank.
Tell people Patrick told you.
You heard it here first. Lots of first times today.
Yeah. So I would say my sort of oddball legal thing is I've been watching an excellent television program on Hulu/FX called Alien Earth. And you might be thinking, well, Patrick, that show's about aliens. That's not about law.
Well, we have some news for you.
Yeah, let me explain this. As an attorney, I can tell you what this is like. So if you're not familiar with the universe of Alien, then the thing that kind of underpins all of it is that they're living in this sort of future where corporations are now sort of running the show above governments. And the legal aspect of that is kind of, it actually plays out somewhat in the show or Alien Earth, where there's disputes between these giant corporations and they settle them instead of going to war with one another by arbitration, which I thought was kind of amusing because like arbitration plays this large role in the advancement of the storyline of Alien Earth. So I recommend watching Alien Earth regardless of whether you're excited by arbitration. And I can promise you that arbitration is not the most exciting thing that happens. And to stick with the theme, I would recommend if you're looking for an alien movie that has a different political or legal analysis, there's a Russian movie from, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago called Sputnik. It's a Russian language movie. It's another alien movie. This one is an alien on Earth, and what the government does to cover it up. And it's a very interesting movie and very engaging and worth watching if you're willing to read a movie.
On an aliens kick.
Yeah.
Awesome.
This is, I mean, if you're listening, this is, I assume most of our audience is libertarian, so I feel like we can talk about like science fiction things at will.
Oh yeah, aliens and government cover-ups are like red meat, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have a sci-fi thing for my non-law thing, but my legal related thing is I read this law review. It's actually a research note. I try and pick like a couple of things a week that are interesting. If I have time for more, I'll read it, but it depends on the length of the thing. Thankfully, this was actually not a super long research note, but it was Mark Tushnet's note called Judicial Time, and it's about this thing that's this concept that, I mean, I find very interesting, and it's the idea that, like political regimes have their own kind of lifetime that lasts a certain amount of time. And in the United States, at least, that has had an impact on, at least it has some influence on the justices that make it on the court. And so there's these kind of judicial regimes that form, and they have their own lifetime. And those justices work on doctrines that kind of come out of those regimes that also have their own separate lifetime. And his point of the research note is going into is that there's overlap between the political whatever political regime might be ascendant at the time and a judicial regime, but because judges have life tenure and doctrines are often will outlive even those justices, you'll end up with these situations where either the judicial regime, whatever you might think that is, and the doctrines are going to outlive political regimes. And so you end up with this kind of mismatch where you have a political regime that's ascendant that is just totally out of step with how the court views law and vice versa. So I found that pretty interesting. And the main thing that he gets into in that article is how should we think about these times when there isn't really a stable political regime, and what do courts do during that period of time? Like, what do they look to as their guiding principles, which I would think the answer is like the Constitution, but he has some other answers for that. But it is a very interesting research note, and I think it's outside of just the article on its own. I think it's going to generate a lot of responses to it that'll probably be just as interesting. And then my non-law thing is kind of sci-fi fantasy. It's Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. I've been reading them. There's like 41 books, which sounds kind of intimidating. He started writing them in the early 80s, and I think the last one was in the like 2015, around then. They're fantasy comedy. So this would be my recommendation for like if anybody likes fantasy books, but it's you want to read something that's written by someone who read all of those fantasy books and then parodies different elements of them. They are extremely well written. They're very, very funny. The setting on its own is kind of quirky. It's this flat world called the Discworld that's being held up by 4 elephants, which are standing on the back of this giant cosmic turtle. And each book is just kind of like a different theme. So you have characters who will pop up and a couple of books, and then it will be several books before you see them again. And there will be books that are about, the guards in the city, and that city is full of, magical beings, wizards, and whatnot. It's just like the day in the life of some average person trying to go to work and deal with being in a city like that. And then you might have a book that's about one of the deities in this world. And so even though they're funny, they kind of run the gamut about being, about family or politics or death or religion, of all this stuff. So they're great to kind of breeze through. If you're a binger, it's nice to have 41 books that are actually relatively short. So I haven't had a consistent pleasure reading series in a while, so that's what I've been sinking into. Have either of you heard about Discworld?
Yeah.
No.
It pre-exists Harry Potter, which I found kind of interesting because it has a lot of things that seem to me like they eventually make their way into Harry Potter. So
interesting.
Inspiration for the napkin writing.
Right. So, Dinah and Patrick, thank you so much for being on the show. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Be sure to tune into our next episode. And until then, that's just like your unpublished opinion, man.